There are some events that happen in life that are so bizarre they sound more like an urban legend than reality. One such event took place in France, and it's such an unusual and fascinating story that Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks created the film The Terminal, which is a film about a man who ends up without a country or identity and is forced to live at the international airport. Though that sounds like a far fetched idea, according to research writers with the Christian Science Monitor, the terminal was based on actual events. In 1988, Maran Karimi Nasseri boarded an airplane in Belgium bound for England with a planned stop to visit Paris. While in Paris, he was mugged, and his Belgium temporary visa, which showed he was granted political refugee status, was stolen. French officials believed the matter could easily be cleared up after he arrived in England, so they allowed him to travel. However, it turned out to become a convoluted matter, and unable to prove who he was at London's Heathrow Airport, they refused to allow him entry and they flew him back to France. However, unable to obtain documents on his identity, they couldn't deport him back to a point of origin. So he simply was left at the airport, where without any documents, he was stuck. He was a man without a country and without an identity. Creating an encampment in the departure lounge at the Charles de Gaulle airport, Moran built an encampment using boxes that he found and bags and suitcases that were given to him by travelers while he waited for a nation to sort this all out. Meanwhile, Britain, France, and Belgium played a lengthy shell game with his case. In 1995, after feeling pressure from the United Nations and the media, the Belgian government decided to appear cooperative by pulling a classic catch 22. They claim they found copies of the court transcripts of Iran's political refugee status. However, to get the paperwork, they insisted that he must travel to Belgium and get them in person. Except he can't board a plane in France without proper documents. And though some suggested that he hire a taxi or board a bus or a train and travel to Belgium, he was informed by French officials he was not allowed to leave the airport. Finally, after 18 years, in 2006, he left the airport due to a medical emergency, which thankfully he survived. And upon his discharge from the hospital, he no longer had to return to the airport, as the French government finally, in a manner of speaking, adopted him and gave him permission to stay anywhere he wants, as long as it's within France. It's quite an unbelievable ordeal for Moran, and it's just utterly bizarre. And though one would hope these bizarre events could be prevented, in last weekend's issue of USA Today, they reported on something just as incredibly bizarre. In 1978, at the age of 2, Michael Liberton was adopted by a loving couple who lived in Illinois. They had traveled to Colombia to adopt him through an international adoption agency located in Minnesota. Michael has lived as an American citizen, has a legitimate social security number, he's paid taxes, and has documents to show that he was adopted by American citizens. However, when he applied for federal assistance so he could attend a technical college in 2016, there was a problem with his application, which took an additional 2 years to sort out. However, not in his favor. In 2018, he was informed that even though he came legally into the United States and he was legally adopted by US citizens, he in fact is not a US citizen. Apparently, there was a document that someone in the court system forgot to fill out initially or just perhaps filed improperly. So Michael has lost his country and his identity. And as bizarre as his situation sounds, it becomes even more fantastic. According to the National Council for Adoptions, there are over 18,000 adults who are legally adopted as children by US citizens and live in the United States, but they do not have a US citizenship. Like Michael, these adoptees are waiting in limbo to know if they will be deported or if they can remain in the US while a bipartisan supported bill makes its way through Congress, which would provide these persons with US citizenship. And several legal experts say this bill would pass as it has bipartisan support. However, they add it's unlikely to be taken up in Washington anytime soon. which is so bizarre and unbelievable, especially considering the adoptive parents of these adoptees invested an inordinate amount of time and costs as they paid attorney and agency fees to ensure nothing like this was missed. These parents invested hard work, emotional risk, and lots of determination to ensure the adoption process was complete. And still, even though there are records at the immigration office and files in the court system that show these children were legally adopted and welcomed into the United States, however, similar to Moran's encounter with the Belgian government, somehow that final step to extend citizenship to these adoptees is being reshuffled and delayed, thus leaving these adoptees without a country and an identity. Thankfully, when Jesus announced we were adopted children of God and citizens of God's kingdom, he meant it. Adopted by God, there are no loopholes to navigate nor systems in place that would prevent us from being the literal sons and daughters of God. Jesus described an adoption process that is filled with incredible love. So we are God's legally adopted daughters and sons. In John 14, Jesus declared that we would not remain orphans because he would claim us as his own, and he would take us into God's house where we are adopted by God. With this statement, it seems that Jesus recognized the remarkable importance of adoption, and he recognized the significance of being adopted into a family where the adoptee has full privileges and rights to their adoptive family's name and status, where they also receive an identity. Repeatedly, Jesus informed his followers that they were adopted through him, so we are heirs to God's realm. This adoption was important to Jesus because he recognized the significance of his own adoption by Joseph. The author of the Gospel of Matthew states that Joseph was not Jesus' birth father, writing that since Joseph was a law-abiding man, after he discovered Mary was pregnant, he immediately recognized that he was not the father of Jesus, and he planned to leave her. However, the angel of the Lord intervened and explained to Joseph everything that had happened and convinced him to change his mind. Accepting Mary as his bride, he accepted the responsibility to care for Jesus as he adopted Jesus as his own flesh and blood son, even though, as the Gospels make it clear, Jesus wasn't. And Jesus acknowledged this, while also recognizing the sacrifice Joseph was willing to make for him as well. Joseph risked his life to hide Jesus from Herod's army. Joseph risked his business and his home to immigrate to Egypt so they could hide from Herod's wrath. And Joseph risked his life by observing the statutes set forth in the law of Moses when he presented Jesus for the naming and purification ritual in the temple, where he made it publicly known that Jesus was his son and therefore the legal heir to the lineage of King David's throne. Joseph took Jesus into the temple, even while Herod was searching for the infant Jesus. A risky move, but one that recognized the significance of honoring God. Through these actions, Joseph modeled for Jesus what it means to adopt someone into their family. Jesus utilized this model then in his ministry when he adopted his disciples and his followers into his family, which provided a model for the early church that regarding how to care for each other and belong in the family is done through this adoption. Later, the Apostle Paul utilized the adoption language in his writings to remind persons that by being adopted by God, we become sisters and brothers with Jesus. He adds that through our adoption, we are no longer followers since we belong in the family. This enables us to become participants in a relationship system that is larger than ourselves because our identity and our citizenship is heaven bound. Wonderfully, since God has adopted us, our adoption can't be canceled nor nullified. No human law or power can remove our adoption. And since our adoption is heaven based, there are no forms nor documents that will ever be misplaced. By receiving God's adoption, we belong to God, where all of us will have access to God, who is our loving parent. And through this adoption, God will always love us and claim us, not as property, but as offspring, which allows us to feel God's support. And no matter how weird things get, God will be there for us and will go through the struggles with us because God has adopted us. And through this adoption, we feel a special connection with God because not only did we pick God, God picked us to love and to cherish. This idea of being picked and cherished by God hit home earlier this year when one of my cousins shared his remembrance of our grandfather at the funeral service. My cousin shared how grateful he was to have been adopted into our family. Even though he was 7 at the time he was chosen by my uncle, he reminded us that he was already part of the family from day one. He said our grandfather never referred to him as anything except as a member of the Stiver clan. He said he received equally my grandfather's love, attention, and support as the rest of our cousins. And he recognized that Grandpa was always so proud to introduce him as his grandson, which gave him an identity, a loving family, and a place to belong. Likewise with us. As we are adopted by God, we have an identity, a loving family, an incredible parent, and a place to belong. Wonderfully, though adoptions can strangely be lost or taken away here on earth, in God's kingdom, our adoption will never be lost as God adopts us and invites us to live in God's house for eternity. Enjoy your adoption and recognize that will never be lost. Celebrating that we are members of God's family, we are reminded that we are all children of God. As God's adopted children, we are all heirs to God's extravagant grace and blessed with every spiritual blessing. As God's children and heirs to God, the Lord invites us to a family celebration. Therefore, let us celebrate and give thanks. We are the children of God.